AI is transforming customer service. It's real and it works. And with Fin, we've built the #1 AI agent for customer service. We're seeing lots of cases where it's solving up to 90% of real queries for real businesses. This includes the real-world complex stuff like issuing a refund or cancelling an order. And we also see it when Fin goes up against competitors. It's top of all the performance benchmarks, top of the G2 leaderboard, and if you're not happy, we'll refund you up to $1 million, which I think says it all. Check it out for yourself at fin.ai.
You know that wellness goal you set at the start of the year? It's not too late to stick with it and make your future self proud, especially with the all-in-one nutrition shake from Kachava. With 25 grams of protein, 6 grams of fiber, greens, adaptogens, and more. No fillers, no nonsense, just the highest quality ingredients. Stick with your wellness goals. Go to kachava.com and use code SMOOTHIE for 15% off. That's KACHAVA.com, code SMOOTHIE.
For Mao Zedong, young people had a special significance, and not in quite the way that, say, for example, they did for Adolf Hitler. Both agreed that the vitality of young people would carry their ideas forward. But Mao was looking at things in a slightly different way. Mao looked at the tendency over time of capitalism, of bourgeois thought to reassert itself. And he thought the only way that you can manage to deal with that is by having young people in a kind of permanent state of readiness, of ideological readiness. And the way that you do that is you do it through the experience of work. And so that's what we're going to look at today. What happened to Mao's young people during the Cultural Revolution. And there is a moment where he views the vitality of young people as important and useful. And then a moment where he views it as a threat. So let's now dive into today's Explaining History podcast. So, as you probably know, recently I've been reading from Red Memory by Tania Branigan. Tania Branigan is the Guardian correspondent for Southeast Asia, and was the and in fact actually was the Guardian's China correspondent, and is the Guardian foreign leader writer, and has spent many years writing about and visiting China. Red Memory is an interesting book. It's the sort of thing I really like in that it kind of examines personal testimony and relates that to a wider history. Initially, in the early days of the Cultural Revolution, Mao invites basically tens of thousands of young cadres and party members to Beijing, and then gives them basically free rein to travel China. And for a lot of young people, the initial stages of the Cultural Revolution are empowering, they're exciting, they're fun, they're enjoyable. They're time spent with friends, they're time spent traveling and exploring. And the some of the heinous violence of the Cultural Revolution, which is violence inflicted by young people on older people, violence inflicted on teachers and academics by students, is when you look at it, is there are all the kind of like the dynamics of peer pressure and of trying to appear to be the most ardent, trying to appear to have the most kind of social capital, that kind of thing. And Mao understood very well that these sorts of dynamics would could mass mobilize young people. But the world is yours, ours too, but in the final analysis, it is yours. You young people, in the prime of your youthful vigour, are like the morning sun. Our hopes rest with you. This was Mao. Tania Branigan writes, no one had thought a revolution could be boring, but by late 1968 the Red Guard's excesses had come to an end. No more burning and smashing feudal relics, or raids on bourgeois homes. Travelling the country in the Great Link-Up was just a memory. Idling alleyways wasn't such fun anymore. After 2 years of study sessions and struggle sessions and nothing much to do at all, even the keenest felt their fervour ebbing. They hadn't expected to miss education, but with their adventures on the railways long behind them, Yu Zhangzhen and her friends pined for books and studies. The one class her school restored was English, an especially odd choice when the Red Guards had besieged and burned the British Embassy only a year before. But all we learned to say, she added, was, by way of explanation, was long live Chairman Mao, long live Chairman Mao. This is interesting. I think things like the Cultural Revolution in Mao's mind were not meant to last as long as they did. Mao saw it as a brief upheaval in order to reassert his dominance over the party. He obviously from 1962 onwards had been sidelined by the party, forced into semi-retirement, and Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping had effectively run the country and had ended the Great Leap Forward and had reinstalled a kind of semi-mixed economy in order to prevent further starvation. And for young people, I think there was a moment of excitement that lasted maybe a year or two, and then it too comes to an end, and people begin to crave more normalcy. They begin, as people often do, they begin to crave routine and the returning of the kind of the business of everyday life. What most people think of as Cultural Revolution, the reign of the Red Guards, was a relatively short stage. The chairman had planned a 3-year movement, but after 2 and a bit, even he was irked by the chaos. He had ordered the military to curb the Red Guards, who were no longer useful. Thwarted teenagers with no outlet for their energies fed the pool of disenchanted urban youth. Education had expanded under the communists, but better opportunities hadn't grown with it. There is an interesting story about Osama bin Laden and the generation of young Saudi kind of aristocrats almost who formed the core of Al Qaeda. So, as we know, from 73 onwards, there's this rapid increase in the price of oil due to the fourth Arab-Israeli war, and huge amounts of wealth pour into the Gulf states and into Saudi Arabia. And this lasts until the mid-1980s when there's an oil slump. So you have all this money pouring around. You have bin Laden Sr. building motorways across Saudi Arabia, cities essentially springing out of the desert. And you have an educated class of young, wealthy men emerging, who are lots of them are engineers, scientists, the kind of people that a rapidly industrializing country needs. And then in the mid 80s, in large part because of Reagan doing various things with the US dollar, there is a mid 80s oil slump. And all of a sudden, you have all this infrastructure, you have this education, you have this demographic, and no jobs for them to do. And so you wind up with a lot of people with time on their hands, education, ideas, and this is problematic to say the least. And then one of them, the young scion of the Bin Laden family, travels to Afghanistan to fight the Mujahideen and essentially says, "Hey lads, you know how everyone's kicking their heels? Well, I've found us something to do." Anyway, it's a bit of an aside, but it shows you demographically and generationally what happens when you have a large and relatively empowered group within society, and you haven't got anything for them to do. It's they tend to find things to occupy themselves with, or they tend to look at the state as the generation of post-emancipation Russian bourgeoisie did. They tend to look at the state and think, you don't provide us with anything. In that case, in the sort of the 1880s, you have again a young, educated, middle class, university educated, who can't get any decent jobs. Russia hasn't industrialized enough. A Russian capitalism hasn't emerged at scale to absorb these educated elites. And also, there aren't enough government jobs because after the emancipation, the landlords and the landowning classes can't make any money because you have to pay your serfs. And so the good thing to do is get yourself a nice, cushy sinecure job with the government and keep out the kind of the upstart bourgeoisie. This is why you get significant numbers of upstart bourgeoisie, Lenin and Trotsky being amongst the number, in that revolutionary class.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles Mackenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip: when it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Pluto TV has thousands of free movies and TV shows.
This is the mindset.
Like Joe Dirt, Pixels, Survivor, and SpongeBob SquarePants.
Free. This is the mindset.
You're welcome.
Pluto TV, stream now, pay never.
These are the sorts of things Mao was kind of mindful of when he decides upon his next move. So again, a fifth of the Chinese population lived in cities without jobs to match. The atmosphere was combustible, a toxic mix of frustration, grudges, fanaticism, adolescent posturing, and sheer idleness. Young people had little to do but look for trouble, hooliganism, and one newspaper fretted, things that do not lead to socialism. And so, on another long, dull day, Yu was summoned by a leader and handed a batch of papers. Her job was to deliver them to friends and schoolmates. There was no choice. It happened overnight, she said. There were 4 possibilities for young people. You could join the army, which was considered glorious, but the criteria was so strict. You had to come from a revolutionary family, or your father and grandfather and even great-grandfather all had to be from very poor families. For girls, there were 200 applicants for every one place. For boys, I'd guess maybe 1 out of a couple of dozen would get in. You could work in a factory, as I did. That was thought very lucky because you got to stay in the city close to your parents. And if you could get into a state-level factory, you were very, very lucky. You could go you could go with the construction corps, big state farming schemes, to Heilongjiang, Inner Mongolia, or Jining. This was not such a bad option. The worst was that you could go to the villages. But this was where almost all of them ended up. Used schoolmates were the first wave in the great tide of urban adolescence that swept towards the impoverished rural China. 17 million boys and girls, enough to people a nation of their own. They are known now as the Lost Generation, but the party called it going up to the mountains and down to the countryside, capturing its lofty justifications and the humble soil in which these students were planted. Some were as young as 14. Many had never spent a night away from home. They were sent hundreds or thousands of miles away and back a century to places with no electricity or running water, perhaps not even reachable by road. As you walked from door to door, handing out notices, every family wept. In the days and weeks that followed, train and bus stations filled with sobbing teenagers and parents gulping back cries of fear. The Great Link-Up had been an adventure. This was the free train rides across China. This was real life, and it was full life. You were to set down roots in your new home, so it wasn't for the summer, it was forever. Since most had relatives in the countryside, they knew how harsh life there could be. Many had lost family members in the Great Famine. They were still kids, and of course people knew that life would be tough, so they were afraid. This is you speaking. The ones who had been so active in the Cultural Revolution's early stages began to realize their good times had come to an end. Mao's ideological compulsions drove this pragmatic solution. Now here we delve into what this is all about. This desire to send city kids to the other side of the country to work in perpetuity on peasant farms. Why do it? Okay. Marx's theory dismissed the peasantry as a relic of feudalism. So Lenin, Stalin, they viewed the peasants as a kind of like a form of human social organization that would soon be kind of eradicated. They viewed the peasants as the bits of feudalism that hadn't died away yet, and they didn't believe that the peasants had a revolutionary consciousness. They weren't educated enough, they weren't socialized enough to think in terms of Marxist dialectics, and you couldn't teach it to them. They believe in superstition, they believe in the king or the czar, they believe in what the church tells them, and their kind of mental world is based around the seasons. It's based around harvest. It's not based around factories. They don't exist in kind of modernity and factory time. Mao, bullied for his farming background as a teenager, had overturned that, seizing on the rural poor as the engine of revolution. Mao essentially looks at the world and he says, not just in China, but everywhere else, the majority, if you line up, if humanity is 10 human beings, 8 of them are peasants. That's the capacity, the revolutionary capacity that you need to sweep away capitalism and imperialism in one go. Now the urban youth were to harness their skills, knowledge, and acuity to the welfare of the countryside. So they would take something to the countryside with them. They would drag forward villagers mired in poverty and ignorance, improving hygiene, spreading literacy, and eradicating superstitions. I think that's quite a lot to ask of a 14-year-old. But the peasant's task was to uproot a more profound form of ignorance, the urban elite's indifference to the masses. Mao had always warned of victory's dangers. Now, this is a really key part of Mao's thinking. And Stalin was kind of a bit like this as well, but Mao particularly, the idea that we can become, complacent in victory, and we can lose sight of struggle. And in sort of Maoist thought, everything is permanent struggle. The Cultural Revolution is an example of that, of endless and never-ending struggle and to keep the revolution alive. Mao had always warned of victory's dangers. Now he had his proof. The sugar-coated bullets of the bourgeoisie had pierced the souls of communists. Cadres who'd worked and fought and risked everything facing down the Kuomintang had been seduced by city living and white-collar work. They'd become comfortable. Mao, who, whatever else you think of him, had experienced significant privation in the many years of struggle against the Kuomintang, and then the period of the Civil War after World War II, had little time for those he thought had become softened by comfortable bourgeois living. Their children had sunk further. Their instinct for comfort over struggle, their selfish concern for family and desire for personal achievement would destroy his legacy. A decade of revisionist education had poisoned them. The peasantry would reforge this generation, teach them to live with nothing, to endure, even love the dirtiest labour, not to merely sacrifice, but efface themselves for the greater good. They would bear his revolution to its ultimate triumph, a country whose economy, society and culture were as communist as its political system. So Mao here is another example of this thing that we see throughout the 20th century, of the attempt to kind of reforge mentalities, reforge entire outlooks and worldviews and philosophies. And he thinks it can be done through labour. And he's not the first to think that either. What Mao believes is that this kind of softening can be undone through hard manual labour, and that the soul of China is amongst its peasantry, and that the Chinese people were in danger of kind of losing that somehow, and in danger of instead the revolutionary achievements being swept aside in a generation. Mao was very quick to look at the Soviet Union and say, well, you know, it hasn't taken you very long. Even in the later years of Stalin, he accused the Soviet Union of losing the fight against capitalism, becoming, again, soft and degenerate in that struggle. And then this is what he absolutely believes of Khrushchev. He sees Khrushchev's he sees the post-Stalinist thaw as a kind of a terrible affront to Marxist-Leninist thought and to Maoism as well. He says basically, I modelled industrial policy and a fair old few other things, you know, 5-year plans and collectivization of agriculture, on Stalinism, and you are renouncing it. You are kind of renouncing me, and also you're seeking accommodation with the capitalist world. You're seeking to turn down the tensions, to dial down the tensions, and this is the beginnings of kind of a slow retreat from revolution, a slow retreat towards towards a kind of a return to capitalism. Ultimately, I mean, in much of his kind of writing, Trotsky argued that this is what would happen. You would wind up, the revolution would be vanquished by a bureaucratic state, and the bureaucratic state would eventually kind of capitulate to capitalism, and you would wind up with a return to capitalism eventually later on, because the bureaucratic state itself would kind of atrophy into nothingness. Okay, so to continue. The propaganda posters show them marching to the fields for another day of labour. They've often paused to address a cheery, wrinkled peasant. Are pink-cheeked, always, guileless, hearty. These handsome children in cotton jackets have sickles or hoes slung over their shoulders, and in their free hands they hold, of course, quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong. Here they were before me on the stage. They were uniformed, Mao-capped and armband, clutching little red books to their hearts as they sang. The slightest of the trio called himself Zhongsheng, or Voice of China. Called himself Zhongsheng, or Voice of China. He didn't think I should use his real name, though nothing he said could possibly have bothered even the most neurotic official. Being an educated youth, A city kid sent down to the countryside had made him braver and stronger, he said, when he stepped off the platform. It had taught him how how to value life and how to take satisfaction in quite ordinary, modest things. He was proud of the strides that his country had made and the little part he played in that, and was grateful to China's leaders. The cluster around him nodded and smiled and whispered to each other. They were the Chongqing Educated Youth Friendship Group, and I'd met them quite by chance in a park that previous day. They'd been dancing in a square by the gates, moving back and forth in a complicated piece of choreography with some waving of scarves and much calling of instructions. So these are people who've been sent to the countryside and they are meeting as friends decades later. And the funny thing is that obviously this was kind of distressing and terrifying and brutalizing for young people on an epic scale. No doubt. When you look at some of the stories of some of the unpublished histories of evacuation in Britain, because it was largely the first evacuation very poorly planned. The histories of physical and sexual abuse amongst evacuees, again, very rarely gets talked about, but there was an absolute ton of it. One can only imagine, with 17 million Chinese children distributed across rural China, what happened to some of them and the kind of lives they led. But you also have, in the midst of all of these things, people who embrace what happened, who not just they make the best of it and think, well, mustn't grumble. They often embrace it on a deep emotional level and emotionally identify with it and emotionally identify with their part in it and their part in kind of history. We helped to make this country what it is. And we struggled, and actually it was the worst of times, it was the best of times. I think it's that sort of mentality. And I think it's curious to imagine, and if anyone is listening in China, please do write into the show. It's just really curious to imagine how that experience, and this is within living memory, these people will be kind of in their mid-50s, perhaps early 60s now, how that maps into life in contemporary China. I would love to know. And how this history of these extraordinary tumultuous times. China, a repressive one-party state where it's ploughing ahead technologically and industrially, but still, if you are imprisoned by the state, it's a pretty unpleasant experience, I would imagine. But it's currently relatively free of extreme upheaval. But you have within living memory upheavals of an unprecedented nature. And I say upheaval, violence and mass death on an unprecedented nature. How you reconcile the past with the present is always a fascinating question. How people in the mid-1960s in Germany did it. How people who in Russia now who think of Stalin did it. How people in the UK who seem to have largely forgotten the troubles in Northern Ireland do it. And yeah, it's a question for the ages. It really is. There are no easy answers. Anyway, I've gone on for long enough, so I'm going to leave you now. Just to let you know, if you head on over to Finds at Patreon, you can get all of these episodes without adverts. And also do check out, I'll put the links below, do check out our America Masterclass. There is going to be a Germany one after that, and then after that there's going to be a China one. Okay, so I'll be going back over all of this stuff as well. And this is in the run up to April. This is the first year we've done any of this, and so I'm going to kind of study the format and refine it for next year. And hopefully we can really build explaining history online into a nice little kind of learning environment. That's sort of the plan anyway. Take good care, Ron. All the best. Bye bye.
You know that wellness goal you set at the start of the year? It's not too late to stick with it and make your future self proud, especially with the all-in-one nutrition shake from Kachava. With 25 grams of protein, 6 grams of fiber, greens, adaptogens, and more. No fillers, no nonsense, just the highest quality ingredients. Stick with your wellness goals. Go to kachava.com and use code SMOOTHIE for 15% off. That's KACHAVA.com, code SMOOTHIE.
Hey, Drake May here. You know that calm you get when your team has a drive under control? That's the same feeling I get investing and saving with Betterment. Their automated technology does the work to help grow your money and save you on taxes. So when the market gets unpredictable, you can stay calm, cool, and confident. That's what I call the Betterment effect. And it's why I'm glad they're on my team. Get started today at Betterment.com.
Investing involves risk. Performance not guaranteed. Paid client ad. Views may not be representative. See App Store and Google Play Store reviews. Learn more at betterment.com/pursuebetter/partners.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.